Yesterday, we talked about drawing profiles of mountains or hills. We talked about this is your class. So we drew one of these, right? We talked about how if you walked up this mountain, you'd be walking from A and over to the top of the mountain, and it would get taller, but it would be a gentle walk up. Then once you got to the top, it would be a steeper walk back down. So it looks something like this. We kind of sketched it out yesterday. Gentle walk to the top and then a steep walk down. That's great. And that is actually a skill you need to be able to have, is to give yourself a rough sketch of what a mountain would look like. But when the Regents asks you to draw a profile, it has to be like to scale. It has to be perfectly drawn. You can't just wing it. And that's what we started yesterday. I thought we'd get through this yesterday, but we didn't. So we wrote the steps for drawing a profile. So today we're going to put those steps into action on page 25. So page 25 is the exact same map I just now gave you, and it resembles graph paper down here. But again, remember, we're not making a real graph. We're just doing a picture on graph paper. So what we got to do is walk through these steps to draw a profile. So step 1 says, determine the contour interval and write it in for each line. So I only labeled a few. I labeled the 0 and a 100. Can you figure out what the rest of the lines are going up by? 20s? How'd you figure that out? It just wing it first. Clearly it's not going up by ones. You could have tried 10s, 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. Because this is the 100 line, that's not right. So I needed something bigger. So 0, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. But there's a problem with how I just did that. Step 2 says to place your scrap paper along the line to be profiled. So I'm going with A to B. What's wrong with the way I already labeled my lines? I just covered them up. It was useless to label them down there. So what I need you to do is every time you see one of these, your labels have to be above where, so you can see them. And yes, you do need to label every single line. So I'm going to redo that label. 0, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. Yes, all the way to where they start going back downhill. They do get pretty close together here, so your labels might be kind of messy. But to be honest, you're the only one who needs to read your labels. So as long as you know what's going on with your labels there, that's good enough. So I know you can't see them. So you guys shouldn't have to be looking at mine to label them, for the record. If we're having troubles labeling, that is a whole new set of problems. So is there anything that we're not sure about how to label these? Okay. Everybody got them labeled all the way across the paper.
Yeah.
Step 2, place your line or place your scrap paper along the line to be profiled. If you didn't grab scrap paper, there's some up there. I've made these little strips of scrap paper just so you don't have to waste a whole sheet of paper just to do these little marks that we're doing. But there's nothing fancy about my scrap paper. You can use the edge of literally anything. Math homework comes in handy. I'm sure Mr. Drake or whoever you have will not care if you have a bunch of little marks on the side of your paper. But anyway, so it said to place your scrap paper along the line to be profiled. Helpful hint, just because I've done this for many years, don't use the very corner of your scrap paper. So slide it over a little bit, kind of give yourself a margin. So now we're going to start by making a mark every place the contour lines. I moved it right there for you. Make a mark every time a contour line touches the scrap paper. And that was kind of a weird set of directions. Here's what that means. Here's the 0 line. Put a mark right there. And label it 0. Without moving your scrap paper even a tiny bit, go all the way across, continuing those labels. So we did the 0, 1. When it gets cramped over here, you can make different size lines. You could abbreviate your numbers. So instead of writing 40, you could just put a 4, as long as you know what that means. So truly, now you have a scrap paper with a bunch of little marks. Like I should be able to walk around and your scrap paper should be literally identical to mine. I am going to take a little trip around just to make sure everybody's got what we're doing so far. Good, looking good. Not overly complicated, right? Let's look a little better. No, this isn't. Yeah, we raise those and make sure they line up perfectly with the. Yeah. So, when the time athletes, those are parents to. Okay, not overly complicated, right? It is important that these are dead smack on. Like you can't wing it at all. They need to line up perfectly. If they don't, your picture is going to look wrong, and then the Regents is going to make me mark it wrong. So these have to mark up and match perfectly. Okay, so once you've got your scrap paper, which I know you guys all do, you bring step 3 said, and again, where am I getting these steps? These are from the notes yesterday. Step 3 says to place your scrap paper on the x-axis, and while I'm here, I'm going to read step 4. For each line on the scrap paper, make a dot on the graph paper directly above it at the number of the contour interval, which really truly means you're going to put your paper down here. Now, again, because this looks like a graph but isn't a graph, it doesn't have to be directly at like the origin over here. In fact, the Regents would probably have given you a mark that said A. That's where that first A is going to go. So kind of, yeah. So you put your paper down here. This has basically become your x-axis. So we're just going to, again, I know it's not really graphing, but you're basically graphing with this being your x-axis. Once you put it there, don't move it. It is now, pretend it's glued to the paper. So here's our mark for 0. We're going to come up to the 0 line. Here's our mark for 20. We're going to come up to the 20 line. I cannot emphasize how important it is to make sure your dots go straight above the mark. So notice that, can you see my faint line? Yeah, you can. That faint line I drew, you can do that too, if you want. So what I mean is to get to that 40, if I was just eyeballing it, my dot might not be directly above my 40 mark. So I do the faint lines in the background, and the Regents is fine with that. Or if you're doing it in pencil, you're welcome to erase those lines. It does get a little messy over on the right side where they're really close together, so take your time. You do not get a ruler, you get a scrap sheet of paper. So you can use the scrap paper as a straight edge, and you can get as many scrap papers as you want. You'll also have a fresh reference table you could use as a ruler. So right now that's steps 1 through 3. Actually 1 through 4. Yep. Should we wait a second? Are you guys still plotting? Okay, give me a minute to keep plotting. steps 5 and 6, they go together. Step 5 says connect the dots. But step 6 reminds you that hills are not flat. So up here where it goes from 0 over to 100, this is the top of the hill. Hills don't go up, 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 and then just flatten out and then go back down. Remember, this has the potential to go to how high does the top of this hill have a potential to be? 119. So could it be 120? No, because there isn't a 120 line, but it can be one less than that. So in other words, when you're connecting these top two, you do not go straight across your paper. You curve it up, but make sure that that curve does not touch the 120 line. It doesn't have to be perfectly to 119 either. It just has to be above 100, below 120. And then you can just connect up the rest of yours. No, the lines don't have to be straight. In fact, they're probably better off being a little curvy because hills don't go, they go nice and neat. And they definitely don't make duck noises. But you knew what my duck noises meant. This one I think was probably the easiest one you could have ever potentially done. And so is the next page. So I want to skip to the harder page. Let's go to page 27. This one was rocking some people's worlds last period. And I guess, and I kind of let them wing it. I'm going to do it together with you guys. For the record, we get out at 43 today. So we have about 13 minutes left. I'll let you wing it on other ones. The next one's just as difficult as this one, but the other one was way too easy, I think. No, we're going to start this, with which one? We're going to just do this one together. Go to this page. Sorry. Yeah. I don't know if I said that. I don't know at this point. So we're on this map that's got C and D. The first thing I want you to notice, guys, where is the C mark? Here is C. Does it go to this black line? No. Same with D. Here's D. It doesn't go to this outside line. That's actually really important. Okay. Step 1, determine the contour interval and write it in for each line. They labeled an 80 and they labeled a 100. Here's the 80. They labeled 100 down here. Can you see that this black line is the 100 all the way around? So here is 100. What's this line? 120, 140, 160, 180. We got a whole bunch of lines over here not labeled. Can you label those? Follow this over. 120. Follow this over. 140. Now this doesn't connect to the 160, but it's still 160. 180 up to 200. How do I know, by the way, that it's getting bigger going to this dark line? How did I know that's not going down? Okay, so it did start 80 to 100. It did not have, good job, Olivia, it didn't have those things on it. So when the lines start getting smaller and smaller and smaller, it's like the peak of a mountain. Remember, the peak is way skinnier than the base of the mountain. So that's what, or if you were going down into a hole like this one was here, again, they get smaller, but they would have had to have those little marks on it. So that's labeled. But then again, when you go and put your scrap paper on, are those enough labels? I personally do not think they are. Now, some of you might think it's okay, but to make your life easier, I would go over here and label right along the lines. And so again, it's just over labeling. But I know from experience that over labels are way easier to deal with than under labeling it. So yes, it's going to take you, is it like going on 30 seconds now to label all of these? But 30 seconds isn't going to kill you, I promise. So yeah, there's a lot of numbers on there. And yes, you have to write little and kind of neatly, but you now look how easy it is when we bring our scrap paper here. I will not take off points if it's not labeled. In fact, the only thing in the end I grade is this. However, I don't have a copy of how they make me grade it. They send me a clear answer sheet. And I put my clear answer sheet over yours. And like if your dot was supposed to be like here on the graph, what they do is they give you like a larger version and they say it has to be within that circle, but that circle's not very big. They give you a little bit of wiggle room, but not very much. So you have to be as accurate as possible. So now again, step 2 says to place your scrap paper along the line to be profiled. Now remember, we're not starting at this dark black line. We're starting here at the C, which is 120. And just go through and do your marks and your labels. And you'll see why it was important to label them all, because like 180 repeats itself a whole bunch. 160 repeats itself a whole bunch.
Do you fit on the map, but not down there? Like
Because I screwed up.
I did.
You did not. On the region. So what London was just pointing out. So again, your scrap paper should look like this. When you bring it down here, on the regions, they will line up perfectly, but I wanted to make it as big as possible and didn't think about the labels. So you can cross off D and just put D wherever the heck D ends up. So again, that's step 3, put your scrap paper along the x-axis. Step 4, go ahead and plot it. I'm gonna get this done and I'll come around and help you guys. Yeah, again, it's not going to fit between those printed C and Ds. That was my fault. On the Regents, I promise it will. You're gonna end up with a bunch of dots, but don't connect it yet because there's a trick. Oh, well, if you've got the, you've got it. Go ahead, connect it up.
We should go do it for once. I pull my towel out and start.
We don't reach on this wall. But walking from C to D, we'll have to start it 120, but it does not.
Oh, I remember watching.
Yeah.
Well, I have them.
Yeah.
But when I watched it,
And that's why I think it's really important that I would stop what you're doing first. And then leave it all right along the way. The skipping the labeling ends up screwing you up, I promise.
Okay, so you see the label in the picture, when I say label, I'm not saying labels. Right?
Mine was right.
Every time it's.
Yeah.
That's why I.
Did I figure it out?
Yeah, mine was the same as yours.
Oh.
Not just up here, okay, right where it's salon and all the
Yeah.
way over the. There's nothing wrong with these labels, but when you cover.
Oh, but it's.
When you go like this, you don't know what the heck this line is. The labels say it's-
Because we're not given other points to go with.
Hey, so I just saw this at about 3 different, I didn't even check on everybody. I know I was talking about there being over labels or under labeling. Look how many labels I got up here. Those labels are really important. When you put your scrap paper there, now I don't have to figure out, because I had 120 labeled up here, but I never got to that 120 down here. It is really important to have every one of those labeled like that. That way, when you make your marks, you're going across and you're 20 or 200, 180, 160. You want to call this line 140 if you don't have it labeled already as a 160. You will screw up if you don't put all the labels. I know it seems like a lot of work, but I promise you it's important. All right, so to connect this up, step 5 and step 6 say connect the dots, but don't forget, hills aren't flat. So in other words, when you go from, you get up to the top and you're at these 2 100s, what's on the inside? What number? Are they bigger, smaller? They're 200 on the inside. Bigger. That's the top of a hill. Remember the numbers. What's the highest number we could have inside the hill? 219. Curve it up. Make
Oh, I was talking about the.
and then we come down here and we're at 160s. Here's a 160. Here's a 160. Is that a hill or is that a valley? How you can check, and I heard a bunch of you say it's a valley, and I agree, is if I was to figure out, okay, well, yes, I'm between 2 160s, but it's also, here's the 140 lines. This is going down towards 140. So that's a little valley. And then back up to another hill and back down. It should look something like that. Any more? Which one? Here?
That last 140, yeah,
Because it stops at D.
I could go on it all.
No, only do what it says. It only told you to go from C to D. Okay? All right, that's it for today. Yes, a bunch of you were absent yesterday. Make sure I see your work. I'm just gonna pull up my grade book and see who needs work.